In this video, we're going to be working on a painting of a landscape using summer light. And the main thing that I think you need to remember as we move into working on this painting is that we have predominantly a bluish light key, color key for the painting. So you want to think about that as being the underlying unifying element in the colors that we mix and in how we're going to approach the painting. So I want us to work on mixing colors that have a harmonious relationship with each other based on having that key color mixed in with almost everything that we're going to be using, but have some sort of relationship to all those colors. So let's dive right on in and talk first about mixing our colors. And here's the palette that we're going to be working with. Remember the greens that we mixed in the green video, and they are right down here on the bottom. Starting in the bottom left-hand corner, we have the Italian Terre Verte mixed with the Egyptian Violet or dioxazine purple. Next to it is a pile of Italian Terre Verte without anything else in it. Next to that, we have the Italian Terre Verte mixed with Phthalo Blue, the warmer dark and the cooler dark. In the next row up above, we have the Italian Terre Verte with a very small amount of the permanent green light. Second from the left in that row is about half Italian Terre Verte and half Italian green ochre. Next to that, Italian Terre Verte with Cinnabar green light, about half and half. Then going to the row above that, we have that mixture that I've talked about so much that I like, that is Cinnabar green light and Monserrat Orange mixed together. So the left-hand one is more Cinnabar green light and less Monserrat Orange. And then as they progress to the right, they get more Monserrat Orange in there, so that I have a range of 3 different values, not that far apart, but mainly 3 different hues and intensities, 3 different temperatures, going from warm to cool. Above that are the 3 colors that I'm going to use for the clouds. They're mixed from a toric gray, or which is a gray that is produced by Gamblin, but you can make your own by mixing Ultramarine Blue and some of the Monserrat Orange and get something that is very, very, very close. So that middle section is mainly a balance between neutralized Ultramarine Blue and Monserrat Orange. Then to the left is a lighter variation that has more Ultramarine Blue in it, and to the right is a lighter variation that has more Monserrat Orange in it. Above that are the 3 blues. The one on the left, French Ultramarine Blue and white. The one in the middle, Phthalo Blue and white with a tiny little bit of the Ultramarine Blue that was on the knife. On the far right, Ultramarine Blue and white with a very small amount of Indian yellow. So those are the colors that we're going to be using in the painting, and you will have seen how to mix those greens in that green demo. Refer back to it if you have any questions at all. Let's dive right on into making our painting. We're going to begin our painting by blocking in that no-tan right at the start. We're going to be using both the dark purple green as well as that very dark blue green. So we're blocking that in and establishing where the darkest patterns are in that composition. Keep it fairly loose and let the marks that you make help establish some of those shapes as you build up the trees on the horizon line. We're going to also block in that dark shadow at the base of the field, which is just an indication of where there's a ditch at the end of the field as it meets the road. But we're going to go on and get that shadow blocked in from the very beginning so that we know where that darkest dark is down at the bottom, and it helps to frame the whole composition. So now we're blocking in with more of that dark blue-green. Since the underlying color key in the summer is that blue, rich blue that's based on phthalo blue more than ultramarine blue. So we're building that blue undertone up before we progress any further in the painting. Once we have the no-tan established, then we're going to move to the sky and fairly quickly block in where those lightest lights are. It's really important at this point to look at the pattern of color, i.e. the hues, and the value patterns that are occurring in the sky. It's really easy to get lost in the complexity of clouds, but if you slow down and look at the basic patterns of light and dark, warm to cool, and one hue to another, it becomes easier to simplify that pattern into some basic underlying shapes. So what you see me doing here is taking the darkest gray for the sky, very little of which will show in the final painting, and blocking it into the sky before we even really begin working in any more of the light. So I've got a little tiny bit of that light established in the upper left-hand corner, but then I'm going straight to the dark of the sky. So you can almost think of this as the no-tan for the sky. It is the darkest value hue pattern for the sky. And again, because I've left the dark on the land and the trees very, very thin, I can come right up to the edge of that no-tan without having too much mixing happen. If you feel uncomfortable doing that at this point, just leave yourself a little bit of a space, because it's very easy to go back and tweak that to establish more of a dance back and forth in that area, so you don't feel like you have those coloring book lines in the end. Right now, it's way more important just to quickly begin to establish those patterns of light and dark and the color masses. So you can see here how quickly that has already begun to flesh out the composition. So super important to establish those really fast. If you move some of the dark into an area where it needs to not be, if it's crossed over into the dark of the tree, just take your flat-ended number 81 knife and push that gray away from the mass of the land. Then you can go back with the larger knife to blocking in. So now you're going to see me start blocking in those lighter values really quickly. I'm working with that mainly phthalo blue and white. Remember, it has a tiny little bit of ultramarine blue in it. The blues that you see in the summer have way more phthalo in them than ultramarine. Normally, not always, and it again depends on the environment that you're in and the weather situation that you have in your particular landscape. Here in the southeast of the USA, we have a lot of moisture in the air at that time of year. So we'll begin to have a buildup of very, very blue light really quickly as we move into summer. So again, at this point, just big general areas. Notice I'm not getting into the small details of the sky at this point. Just very quickly getting those patterns of dark gray against the blue of the sky. Now I've got a little bit of the ultramarine blue and white on my knife. That is actually another cloud pattern. That is not open sky. French ultramarine blue and white makes a wonderful color for clouds that still are catching some light, but down at the horizon line. So it is frequently a color that I will use, or a mixture that I will use to create that cloud pattern. So here we're going to begin to break those cloud patterns up a little bit, pulling some more of that French ultramarine blue up into the rest of the clouds. So remember always to work from general to the specific. So we don't have huge details yet, and we won't really begin building those details until we've established some color, the color masses in the rest of the painting. So blocking in that far right hand dark. And there we have the basic color masses for the sky in place. Always remember, I know I harp on this, but do not forget to wipe that knife very frequently. So now we're going to block in that larger area on the land. And this is with the Italian Terre Verte that has that tiny little bit of permanent green light in it, which makes it a more pure, rich green. The landmass there is somewhat shadowed. It's not really in shadow, but this is a day with mixed light and clouds, so the shadows are greatly diminished. So there's not a strong breakup of the shape into multiple different shadows because of that loss of the extreme lighting condition there. So you've got a little bit of mixed clouds. So just really quickly blocking that in. Notice it is just as thin as the no-tan was. Also notice that I'm not worrying about getting right up on that tree mass at the back, because there is a lighter color that is going to go in there. So again, just quickly blocking in that dark to medium green. That is the base color and base value for that front color mass. Taking it right over the shadow that is the edge of the ditch. So then you can tweak and adjust that shape. Make sure that it is established in all the dominant areas and that the thickness to thinness is working. Next, we're going to begin to break those larger shapes up into smaller shapes. Working on the sky first. I'm going to bring some of that French ultramarine blue into that left-hand side of the painting. So go on and rotate the painting, turn it so it's easier to work on. And I'm moving the knife in a pattern that's fairly parallel to the ground, because that's what those kind of clouds do as they move across the sky. So I'm going to move the knife into the pattern that I want the clouds to take. If it gets a little too thick, scrape it back, but make sure you're not building it up super thick at this point. So remember, after you block in and establish one main color for each shape, just like you do in your thumbnail, then you're going to go back and break those larger shapes up into smaller shapes and break their singular color mass into slightly more complex color masses. So that means in the sky, in the blue sections, I'm going to begin to break them up into lighter blues and darker blues, cooler blues and warmer blues. Same thing will happen in the sky. In the clouds, sorry. I'll begin to break up that really dark gray mass into something that has more variation going from light to dark and warm to cool. So here I'm taking a smaller knife and going into that tight space between the sky and the tree mass. So work as much of it in as you can with the larger knife before switching to that smaller knife. So we're going to break up that sky even more. I'm really working right now predominantly on that area where the sky gets close to the land. So I'm going to work from there up. And the reason I'm doing that is that area that's close to the land, close to the horizon line, is the part of the sky that's the furthest away. So one just really good thing to remember when you're working particularly with an observational painting or a representational painting is to work from the background to the foreground. So you want to work from far away to up close. That way the paint that you put on in the later layers will be on top of the paint that you put on in the earlier layers. So it's really important to remember, go background to foreground. That makes it so much easier to build up that sense of space. And then I'm breaking my own rule by going on and adding some of that darker green back into the foreground of the painting to establish that sense of the ditch. That there's a dark shadow right there at the front. One of the things that's interesting to me about that particular landscape, that particular time of day, is that the trees are almost silhouetted against that light sky. Even though they're silhouetted, there's still a number of variations of green in there. So I'm working back and forth in that tree mass, that main big tree mass, and breaking up that dark, dark shadow with a number of different greens that are just slightly different in both value and intensity and in hue. So I had those medium ones, which were just Terre Verte, and Terre Verte with a little permanent green light. And now I'm kissing it, just lightly with a little bit of the warm green, which was the Italian Terre Verte and the Italian green ochre mixture. So just a tiny little bit of that where there is some light striking the very top parts of those trees. Now we're going to start breaking up the mass of the grass in front. You don't want to leave it as all one single value that is unbroken. You also don't want to get so caught up in details that you're painting individual blades of grass. That's not what your eye sees. So I'm working cool to warm. I've got the darkest darks established in the foreground. And now I'm going to block in a lighter, warmer green on top of that. And I'm going to establish some light patterns in that grass where little strips of light are hitting it to give you a sense of depth. This is that Cinnabar green light mixed with the Monserrat Orange. That same color is going in along the horizon line. Remember, I said you didn't need to worry about that horizon line too much at this point. That's because there was going to be a color, a lighter color on top of it. So you didn't need to worry about the join line between the block-in color of the grass and the trees. So I'm just really quickly putting in that Cinnabar green line. And then I'm going to keep breaking that up just a little bit more. Again, don't forget to frequently wipe your knife. You can see I'm using that quarter sheet of paper towel, then wiping both directions, folding it in half. That is how you keep your hands from turning into a hot mess. So at this point, I want to turn and work on the top half of the painting a little bit more and do that little dance back and forth with where the tree mass is hitting the grass. So I'm trying to refine that edge where the tree mass is hitting the grass and making sure that the darkest darks are still present in that particular area of the painting. So it's really helpful to turn the painting back and forth as you're working so that it's easy to pull the knife in the appropriate direction. You can do the same thing if it's on an easel. Do not be afraid to turn your painting upside down. So that line needed to be broken up a little bit so that it had a sense of not being quite as geometric. And by pulling it up towards those trees, then it begins to have a broken edge that resembles the breaking up of grass a little bit more strongly. So now we're going to go into those clouds with the warmer gray. So we're going straight from the darkest dark to the lightest light in the clouds. And remember that warmer gray was made from either Ultramarine Blue and Monserrat Orange with a little bit of white, or the Torrid Gray Monserrat Orange and a little bit of white. So what you're looking for is a warmer gray and a lighter gray. So you want to go both warmer and lighter. And that is going to give you the effect of light hitting the clouds. And remember that the light is hitting the clouds based on where the direction of the sun is. So you can tell when you look at that photograph that the sun is to the left. So we have side lighting here. It's to the left and slightly to the back, but mainly straight side lighting. So I'm blocking in that lighter cloud color everywhere that that plane of the cloud is facing the sun. And you can see how quickly it begins to establish a sense of space. Even if you're working abstractly, you want to play back and forth between warm and cool color contrasts, between light and dark color contrast. It adds visual interest and helps to create a strong composition that holds the viewer's attention. Now we're going to break up that French Ultramarine Blue at the bottom with little threads of the Phthalo Blue. One of the things that happens in those far distant clouds is that they're not solid. So you'll have a range of small, very linear, horizontal bands of the blue, the Phthalo Blue and white, showing through the French Ultramarine Blue and white. That will help imply that you've got some strong sense of space in there. So make sure that you're adding some of those lighter bands of Phthalo Blue and white to the horizon line, because that French Ultramarine Blue area is not going to be solid. Then you can go back in and tweak that dark cloud. And remember, I said very little of that dark, dark, dark is going to show through in the end. Only on the undersides of the clouds. That's where the rain is held. So it's going to help establish again that sense of space. A lot of times people forget as they're painting clouds that you're dealing with the same kind of color contrast that you're dealing with in the land itself. So make sure that you give as much value variation to those clouds as you do to the landscape. And actually here in this painting, I'm giving more. Also remember that the clouds towards the top of the painting are closer to you than the ones towards the horizon. So here we're getting some of that middle as well as light value established in the clouds. So moving back and forth between the cooler blue, blue-gray, and the warmer gray. Kind of a dance that helps to create that sense of volume and space. So moving some of the French ultramarine back in to break up those bands towards the bottom so they're not quite as sudden in the transition from foreground to background in the clouds. And then working back in some of the phthalo blue and white. Now the color for the lightest part of the clouds is just a warm white. So if you take just a tiny little bit of Indian yellow or a tiny little bit of yellow ochre and add it to white, that will make a warm white. You can also buy a warm white from Gamblin or many of the other manufacturers. You'll hardly ever see an actual pure white in a cloud. So you want to make sure you're continuing that contrast of warm to cool, light to dark. So here I'm using a white that's warmed up slightly with a yellow ochre to create that warm white. So it's just the area of the clouds that are catching the most light. You can use that really light warm white to begin to establish something of a focal point just in the sky. Then as we move to looking at that left-hand side, we're going to add some more blue, break up the cloud bank on the left as well as the right. So this is just that back and forth dance between warm and cool, light and dark. So some more of the slightly cooler gray and some phthalo blue and white into the upper right hand side. And some more of that warm white to establish where the light is hitting on the clouds. You don't want that area of warm light to be broken up into too many little tiny dabs of light, or it won't read as a color mass. So make sure you're not breaking up your lights into lots of little tiny dabs of light. They need to hang together as a color mass and as a pattern. So we're moving into the final stages of the painting and establishing the very last parts of the final block in. Well, it's really not a block in at this stage. It's the final parts of the breaking it up into multiple values. So you can go back in and where needed, darken up the clouds a little bit or lighten. So at this stage, you really want to watch for those patterns of light and dark and make sure they're sticking together so that when you look at it from a distance, you're seeing color masses and not individual little dabs. Your marks might actually be smaller, but they need to read as a larger color mass when they're looked at from a distance. So just putting back in some more darks so that those read from left to right is a transition from light to dark. So you'll notice that the left-hand side of the painting in the sky is a little bit lighter than the right-hand side. That's very intentional. And you want to look at that transition and make sure that it's real clearly established. When you look at the sky, very rarely is it exactly the same from left to right as far as either hue, value, intensity, or temperature. So you really want to make sure that you have some changes happening, not just from top to bottom, but also from left to right. Again, don't forget to wipe your knife frequently. So here we're really coming into the final stages. And I'm adding a small line of Phthalo Blue mixed with a tiny little bit of white and some of the green. So it's a little bit of blue-green. And remember, I've said before, as you get to the last stages of a painting, although I say to mix your colors ahead of time, you can mix together some of the hues that you have to create different ones. By that time, if you've got colors that relate to each other, those mixed hues are still going to relate to your basic palette. So I'm adding a really cool green, almost totally a phthalo blue, to that distant grass in the landscape to be a contrast to the warmer green where the sunlight is striking. So you're going to have a warm, cool contrast. Then going back and tweaking the area where the sky meets the land. So at this stage, just minor tweaks. And 9 times out of 10, you need to stop before you think you're done. And at least slowly consider making any final tweaks so that you do not overwork the painting. So right now I'm just going back in and breaking up that blue line a little bit. You don't want to establish it as a straight line running all the way across. So I'm holding the knife with both hands to make sure I'm really controlling it as I barely touch the painting with that phthalo blue and white, phthalo blue green and white mixture. And just breaking up that foreground a little bit more. And adding the final darks. So there you have it. That is our summer landscape. Let us know how it works for you. Post your painting in the Facebook group if you would like. Happy painting!